Okay, so we've just recorded a big video for the channel on idealism and materialism. So I'm just with my mate Rob Stroud, who was a founder member of the Tippling Philosophers. I'm a Tippling philosopher. I'm just one of us. And I thought we'd just have an extra sort of 10 minutes or so talking about necessary versus contingent. And I'm interested, you as a theist of sorts, you used to be a very strong conservative Christian. You've gone through an evolution of beliefs to ending up where you are now, which is, who knows, but I don't necessarily. But that's kind of irrelevant. I'm interested in picking your brains on this. And this is something I had a chat about earlier today, Rob. So, if you had God existing in God world, right? So causally prior to creating anything. And I would say that in that sense, so whether you believe in this kind of God or not is irrelevant. Let's play around with ideas. So this God exists as arguably an omni God. So there's no time because time hasn't been created yet. So therefore, everything happens in an instant. There's no deliberation. There's no thinking. I don't think God can ever make a choice in God world where there is no time because there's no space-time being created, as far as the general understanding of space-time that we have. So therefore, there just is God, and then instantaneously there is creation. So therefore, all the contingent, what that philosophers like to separate God as a necessary being from that which God creates, which is contingent upon God. I would argue that every bit of creation is just as equally necessary as God, given that God exists and instantaneously creates at the same time. And that creation also must fit in with omnibenevolence, omnipotence, and omniscience and divine foreknowledge. What are your thoughts about that? The you and I is equally necessary as God.
Are you asking in a way that last bit there, whether anything that, if you like, comes out of God that's created is necessary in a way? Yeah. So what's contingent? Is contingency really a thing?
No, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I probably need to look into this more, but I am interested in this idea that actually I think it's a false distinction between contingency. So they talk about possible worlds, and necessary is something that exists in every possible world. And there are people who actually just say, well, possible worlds isn't a thing, and it's just a made up sort of scenario. So I don't want to get into the whole possible worlds philosophy, but just the idea that if you've got an omni-God that exists and necessary as a necessary being, creation, if it's happening without deliberation and it's almost automatic and instantaneous, then therefore it's just a natural outpouring of the necessary being, and it's almost like a necessary outpouring of a necessary being, and it's equally as necessary. I don't know.
Yeah. So that'd be a kind of determinism within that being, wouldn't it?
Yeah, so interestingly, I have argued before that God can't have free will, because if God has all those characteristics to which he must adhere, he must be omnibenevolent, omniscient, omnipotent, and have divine foreknowledge. Everything that gets created, the omnibenevolence one being the most important here, which everything that is created has to be, God can't choose to create something that's truly horrible, that involves huge amounts of gratuitous suffering, because then God wouldn't be omnibenevolent. If you truly believe God is all loving, then every creation has to be, God has no free will but to create in accordance with his own nature.
Yeah. and how, what meaning would free have if you have to do something that's not in your will?
So this is what Arthur Schopenhauer said. So when people talk about free will, and you say, compatibilists would say, you have free will because you can do what you want. And Arthur Schopenhauer said, a man can do what he wills, but he can't will what he wills, which is to say that, he can do what he wants, but what he wants is it's self-determined, right? And so therefore there's your determinism. And that's perfectly applicable, I would argue, to God, which is to say that God's nature is itself set in stone and apparently immutable, if you believe in classical theism of omni, omni, omni. And in which case, God has to create to optimal benevolence.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different question in a sense. You're getting into the kind of what sort of contingent creation should
Yeah.
be.
Sorry, that's two things. There's a contingent
Yeah,
necessary,
no.
and
I don't know. I grab my if I can grab a. It's too far away. I think I was going to grab a pen and draw it out, but I don't know if you. I remember when back in the days when we used to teach in schools, I used to talk about necessity and contingency. Like imagine a branch on a Christmas tree, and then you've got a bauble hanging here, and then you've got another bauble hanging below it, and it's not a very good analogy. So I just thought I'd bring in a really bad analogy just for the fun of it. But because it's not acting out anyway, no analogies, because there's everything that we're going to draw on is going to be a contingent thing of some sort. So we're not going to find a decent analogy in nature. But let's say you have N, necessary being, line, contingent thing, line, contingent thing hangs off that. Then there might be other contingent things that it might kind of branch out or what have you. If you said, for example, and you could discuss this, as you might not have to accept this with you, but if you're going to say that N also has a kind of fixed being, it has to be true to itself, which I'd say probably has to be, isn't it? Then in what sense are these C's down here not N's? I would say that they are sort of ends if you understand them in a certain way, that they were going to happen, but they're contingent in the sense that they are things that exist that can't exist without the first thing.
Yeah, but
so that would be the difference.
You could argue that the first thing won't ever exist. N won't ever exist without the C's.
Well, it doesn't depend on them for their existence, but it won't exist without doing them.
Yeah,
but that's a distinction. It's a different idea.
Yeah. And I think part of the problem is time here. So part of the problem is that when we talk about before and next and after and contingency almost requires some kind of temporal understanding. But of course, without creating time, there is no time, and therefore there is no before. Which is why we're careful to talk about causally prior to, as if that really makes sense of as if causation, because actually in my Quran book I talked about how causation requires time, and so therefore I would argue that God couldn't create from God world to something, because actually you wouldn't have time, and causality requires time. There's different ways of understanding causality, but you could understand it in change, and of course you can't have change without time, and therefore we could argue that I don't know where this goes, because you could say, right, there's a necessary being, but a necessary being just couldn't create without time.
And also it's interesting as well, because you can get, so if you get into sort of classic Trinitarian theology of various types, you might have within the necessary being contingencies. So you might have, for example, the Son is to some degree contingent on the Father. He proceeds eternally from the Father. There's a relationship of contingency, but it necessarily is going to exist as well.
Oh yeah, so we get back to the Holy Trinity making loads of sense.
I only bring that up not to discuss the Trinity as such, but just that you could have. So within an entity that's necessary, you might have dependence, might be a better word. Dependent aspects within something. And can we think of that in terms of our own nature?
I suppose, so going back to the necessary contingent, when we talk about like creating, is there, given that I suppose the question is there only one optimal creation that you could have? So if you're saying like God, so say God has a range of 10 different creations that God could do, but 9 of them don't have as optimal a an amount of benevolence, there must be some gratuitous suffering in 9 of them, but there's no gratuitous suffering in the 10th. So the question might be that are there creations that have exactly the same amount of suffering or benevolence? Like, could God create more than one thing? And if so, is God necessarily bound to create those that either creates one reality, which must be this one at least, that is the optimal. This is a perfect world, either in the journey we're going towards or as it is now. How are you going to interpret that? This is a perfect world, or there's more than one perfect world, but they're equally perfect, exactly equally perfect. Can you have two exactly equally perfect worlds? I don't know.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. Good question.
There you go. And silence. But
I don't know. Yeah, I suppose it depends. The only way we can think about that maybe is by analogy, a limited human analogy, I guess, of like you're going to design for your kids like the perfect birthday party, you know, and it's going to be all the things your kids love in it, but they equally, you think, that doesn't matter whether they do or they don't, but you think they equally love orange balloons, just having orange balloons, or having multicolored variety of balloons at the party. So there's equal value in either outcome, So is it then
there could be a bunch of universes? Yes. So that's interesting. So there could be a bunch of universes out there that are equally as benevolent as this universe, but it just happens that green is blue. It doesn't make any difference. Like the fact that all colors are reversed, and eventually you would just interpret blue as green. It makes no difference.
Yeah. So do you create them all?
Yeah. So are there just and therefore are those universes? Are there infinite amounts of those universes, or a finite amount of equally benevolent universes? Oh,
well, yeah, and then how do you separate them? Something we talked about earlier on today was that if I've got lots of different universes, it's no different in the sense of having one party going on in this room and another party going on that room. They're all rooms known to me. They're all universes or realities known to me. They are one reality. It's all part of the overall reality.
There's God world and God creation.
Yeah,
exactly. So you're back to that's a really good point, actually, Rob. So you're back to the same thing. So whether God creates one extra world, one world, or 50 billion worlds, or infinite number of worlds, it doesn't get away from the fact that are they all necessary outpourings of God? Are they necessary? Is creation literally some part of God's existence? A necessary part of God's existence. In other words, so if we're talking about every possible world, in all possible worlds, God exists, right? That's how God would be explained as a necessary being. So God exists in all worlds. But if God exists in all worlds, all creations of God would exist in all worlds. And therefore, we are necessary in the same way that God is necessary, because we would exist in all possible worlds.
Run that bit again, because I was just wondering if there was a slight...
So when you were talking about like necessary, contingent,
just checking the logic there,
and you defined a slight difference between necessary and contingent, saying that there's some kind of dependency there. But the philosophical definition of necessity is existing in all possible worlds, right? There is no possible world where God doesn't exist. I mean, that's part of the ontological argument for God, kind of like God exists in all possible worlds. That's how God is defined as being necessary. But if we're then saying, well, God will create benevolently, but there is either one or a billion different ways that God can do that. But if God exists, this creation just overflows from God kind of necessarily, then if God exists in every possible world, then this creation, i.e., you and I, will exist in every possible world.
So every possible world doesn't have to be actualized.
No, but
God exists, does it?
what that says is that you and I, or this world, assuming it's a benevolent outpouring of God, is equally necessary as God, because it exists in every possible world. So there isn't really a difference.
Could there be perfect worlds that are just, like your orange balloons for your son's party, is equally valuable as one where you've got
right? So you're saying that,
do it's a possible world in a sense, but it's not one you're obliged to do. You just might think, well, I've got this one, but then if it doesn't add value, would you then find a reason? The reason would have to come within you. That's what would compel you to do it. What would compel you to do something else that's not adding any value? So only if it's adding value would you then actualize that extra world, I suppose, as a part of the world ensemble.
So we go back to this idea that but the problem is God doesn't get to deliberate outside of time. I think this all does really devolve back to a conversation about time, because if God is just automatically creating, then the mechanism is that God creates that which is the most benevolent. But if there's no way of deliberating between blue and orange, either it's random, so either God randomly outpours instantaneously an orange world in this case, but in world 2 it's a blue world, and there's no difference in benevolence, they've got the same benevolence, but this allows them to be contingent because they don't exist in all possible worlds. Or if it's an instantaneous natural outpouring, it has to be all the worlds, which means in every possible world all equally benevolent worlds are created. I don't know if I'm making any sense. I don't know if you follow my train of thought there.
Yes, it's either arbitrary or you do them all.
It's either random. Yeah. If it's random, then we are contingent, and if it's you do them all, I see it as equally as necessary as God.
I'd see them as maybe using the word contingent. I'd see them, as contingent in that they don't have their being outside of the necessary being, but they doesn't mean they would necessarily exist.
But if God is an outpouring necessarily, like literally every possible world, all worlds are created that are equally optimally benevolent, then we are equally as necessary as God. We aren't contingent in a way that in possible worlds definitions of necessity.
Well, I'd say they're contingent in the sense they depend on their existence on that necessary being, but they're determined.
But they exist in every possible world. So they are necessary. There's literally every scenario in which that thing exists. Therefore, it's a necessary scenario.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. But I would understand by contingency an element of dependency. So something might be determined that it can't not exist. It can't not happen.
Yeah.
But still be dependent on something else, which itself doesn't depend on anything else for its existence.
It depends whether you're arbitrarily cutting things up in causal rather than looking at everything as a whole.
Yeah, I mean, the buck has to stop somewhere, but something is necessary.
Something is necessary. Or possible worlds is just a load of rubbish, and it's a not a very good way of looking at the existence. Anyway, there you go. That's something to ponder. Necessary versus contingent. Are we necessary or are we not? I think I'm necessary, but I'm not sure about you.
Yeah.
But anyway.
Well,
Anyway, thanks, Rob. Cheers, buddy.
I don't know what to say to that.
No.
I was going to try and come back with a quick quip, but there wasn't a necessary impulse in me to find it.
You don't have divine attributes.
I was contingent on having had a beer earlier, and so it was just too slow.
Brilliant. Cheers, dude. See you later.
Take care.